In this video, I'm joined by Dr. Anthony Chaffee to discuss his opinion on fruit and if he thinks there are any types of people who might benefit from adding fruit to their carnivore diet. Now, Dr. Chaffee, you obviously don't eat fruit. What are your main concerns with it?
We know these things have toxins, all the different toxins we talk about in different vegetables and leafy greens and all these other sorts of things. They exist in some degree in fruit, like grapes have tannins, avocados have oxalates and many other things. And a bunch of lectins and nightshade and solanines and nightshades and tomatoes, etc., peppers, eggplants. And so, and we know these are quite toxic to other animals as well. We have more defenses towards certain things. And so, but grapes and avocados will kill cats and dogs. You can't feed them. Grapes and avocados, they're very toxic. They're deadly toxic to them. And so what does that mean? That means there's toxins in them. Now we have some protections against these things, but they're not going to be perfect. Tannins. I mean, you can't necessarily protect yourself against all of them because a major thing that they do is they just denature proteins and stop them from being able to be absorbed. So at the very least, you're going to get anti-nutrient effect where you're not going to be able to get as nourished from your food if you include different fruits like grapes. Um, the sweeter fruits, the ones with fructose in them, seem to be that we have more protections against some of those, the toxins in some of those, like grapes and things like that. But the fructose itself is not good for us. We can handle it to a certain extent. The fiber and vitamin C and other sorts of things can mitigate the effects of fructose, but that can be overwhelmed, especially if you're eating quite a lot of it. And fiber can block up to as much as 30% of nutrient absorption, which is also not great, because that's an anti-nutrient. So it's blocking out things you don't want, but it's also blocking out things you do want. And so they say, people like Dr. Lustig, who I have huge respect for, he says he's been railing against fructose and how harmful it is for a decade and a half now. And but he says, like, oh yeah, fruit's fine though because it has fiber. But in his own book, he says that fiber can only block up to 30% of the absorption. So that means 70% is getting through. Okay, so however much you eat, hit that, multiply that by 70%, and there you go. It's still causing a bit of harm. When I was talking about the research, that Professor Lustig's research with some colleagues in my intern year, there's one gentleman. He was like a head of a department at a hospital in India before he moved to Europe, and I was talking about all this, and he said, that's really interesting what you're saying about fructose because there's an area in India, I forget the name of it, that he said, and this is back in 2013, and he said that in that area the mangoes grow so plentiful and they're so abundant that for 3 months out of the year, everybody there, they exclusively eat mangoes. They don't eat anything else because they're just eating mangoes. They have them, and they're just so good, and they're addictive, and they're sweet, and they just chow down. And so that they have the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in all of India. And the Lancet published a paper in 2018 showing that in rural and urban areas that people in India have a 25% type 2 diabetes rate. And so this is the highest rate of type 2 diabetes, so it would presumably be higher than that. And they actually had an ordinance from the government saying they're not allowed to eat more than 3 mangoes a day. They have to eat other things. They can't just eat those. So when people say like, no, you'll never get metabolic issues or obesity or diabetes from eating fruit. Well, it depends on how much fruit you eat and the type of fruit, because mangoes are very sweet. They're not natural. These are not the fruit that we would have been eating, even locally and seasonally for 2 weeks out of the year. We certainly wouldn't be eating them every single day all year round like some people are doing, and and they've been hybridized and bred to be much more sweet than they ever have been. And you can Google the original forms of these fruit, like mangoes, huge seed, very small amount of meat, very fibrous, very mildly sweet at best. And apples were very, very sour. Most berries were very sour. Strawberries were tiny little sour things. And so that's if we were eating fruit, that's what we would have been eating. So if we're trying to stick to our biological design, then we shouldn't be eating any of the fruit that exists now, and you certainly shouldn't be eating the fruit that is coming from a store, because you would only have access to the fruit in your area for a very limited period of time, and then you would not have that. And so you would not have access to fruit all year round. And then the final point on why this is a bad idea to eat, especially store-bought fruit, is that when again, a seed is a plant's baby, and so they're going to protect it. And so the seed itself has a lot of toxins in it, but when the fruit is unripe, it has a lot of toxins in it because it doesn't want anything messing with that thing. Now, when it's ripened, it can still have a lot of toxins in it. We can deal with some of those toxins better than others, but most fruit will still kill us if we eat it. Most fruit and berries will still make us very sick or kill us. That's just a botanical fact. And the ones that don't do that, they will be far more harmful. They'll have far more of these toxins that we have a limited capacity to deal with. But you overwhelm your limited capacity, and we have a capacity to deal with cigarettes and alcohol and all these other sorts of things. But if you do this again and again and again and again and again, days after years after decades, you are going to build up harm and damage to your body that your body can't contend with. And the same goes for fruit. As an apple the same as a shot of whiskey? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just using that as an example of just slow exposures over time causing harm. And when you're getting fruit that's picked unripe, you're picking it when it has its highest toxic burden. And studies have shown that they don't detoxify by ripening in the box. They have to ripen on the plant. And when you pick it, I mean, think about this. This is just, this is physics. It's a closed system. Nothing can go in or out, right? So you pick that fruit. Now it's just a completely isolated system. And so where are the toxins to go? People say, well, they sort of have this romantic idea that they'll just break down and disappear into vitamin C or something like that. They don't. They stay there and they don't break down, and many of these things will stay there. So they've had and they've tested this in particularly in tomatoes. If you pick tomatoes green, and the passed down wisdom for hundreds of years was that you don't eat green tomatoes because they're poisonous. And then people say, well, it doesn't poison. It's not going to kill you. It doesn't have to kill you that day to be poisonous. It just has to be harmful. It just has to do something deleterious to your body. And it does. And so they found that picking them green and then ripening them in the box, they have the same amount of toxins that if you than if you ate them green. So, talking about oxalates with avocados, they have 4 times the amount of oxalates when they're picked green. And those oxalates don't go away. They stay there. So this can apply to all fruit. And so if you're going to eat fruit, again, it should be seasonal and local. Why is that? A, limit the amount and the supply that you have to a particular time of year and a particular amount of access. You're not going to be able to overburden yourself with this stuff. Unlike in India, where they have all these hybridized mangoes and groves, where they just can really overdo it. Um, but if we're talking about natural fruits and things like that, but also they would be much less sweet, and they would also be ripe. That you would pick them ripe, and or maybe even off the ground, so they would not have as many toxins in them as well. So it's a very different experience eating fruit out in the nature when you're picking things ripe and it's only available for a couple of weeks, and a very different variety of fruit as well. So, and that's all a very complicated way of dealing with something that we don't have to have. This is not
Mhm.
something that we require. I mean, we don't need to like sit down like, okay, how do we track down buffalo and how do we do this and get this schemata to take down like a herd and things like that because we need this. And we're talking about all these different things, these complicated ways of addressing eating fruit, which we don't need. So it's just like to me it's just a sort of a waste of time.
A big argument a lot of people have against a carnivore diet is that a long-term ketogenic state is stressful for the human body. So they reckon, by putting fruit in, it resolves this issue.
People have been doing Atkins for a very long time. Atkins is a very strong ketogenic diet. It's traditional teaching was less than 10 grams of carbohydrates a day, if any. And so, that's a very strong ketogenic diet. And people have been doing this for decades. And people have been teaching it for decades and using it in clinical practice for decades. Professor Eric Westman at Duke University, he's been using Atkins, the ketogenic diets, for 25 years in clinical practice at Duke, one of the top medical centers and medical schools in America. Like when I was going through medical school, I did my sub internship in plastics, reconstructive, and maxillofacial surgery at Duke. And at the time, it was ranked the number 4 hospital in America, which means it's about the number 4 hospital in the world. And so this is not a slouch center. This is a center of excellence. It is named as a center of excellence, and he's been doing this there for 25 years, and he's been getting great results. And you ask him, and I have asked him, does this work for everybody, or just some people? He's like, no, it absolutely works for everybody. This is just human physiology, and this is how it works. Um, Also, the evidence that the Ray Peat people used to say that this causes stress and raises your cortisol is actually not true. It's a theory. They say that, well, cortisol is used to make gluconeogenesis, and then you're going to have to make more gluconeogenesis, and that's going to raise your cortisol. It's all theory. There's no actual practical evidence that happens. They're just saying, I bet you it could. I bet you it does. Okay, but it doesn't in real life. In fact, there was a recent study that Dr. Baker spoke about on his channel that showed that whether you're in ketosis or not in ketosis, the rate of gluconeogenesis really doesn't change. It's pretty consistent and steady the whole time. So you don't actually increase gluconeogenesis just because you're in ketosis. In fact, the majority of the energy you're getting is not coming from carbohydrates. It's you're prioritizing fat and fat oxidation. So you don't actually need to go through all this gluconeogenesis and stuff like that. You make basically the same amount anyway. Whether you're eating carbs or not, you're making the same amount of carbs yourself. And now you're adding on to that. So your blood sugar is going to be perfect all the time if you don't eat carbs. And then you eat carbs and now it's going off of that, right? So gluconeogenesis happens, whether we like it or not, and it happens to the same degree, whether we like it or not, to a large extent, according to that study. And if you look at the data, some of the things that they put forward, and I did a whole critique on this. It was like a 2.5-hour video with my friend Richard Smith, and we just went through all the data. We went through the arguments, the repeat arguments on Dr. Mercola's show, and I debated Georgie Dinkoff, who's a proponent of repeat, and very nice guy, and we had a friendly discussion about it. And I had again a friendly discussion, with Paul about this. And first of all, we have these people who've been doing ketogenic carnivore diets. We have entire civilizations that have been doing ketogenic carnivore diets, like the Inuit and so on. Everybody who's lived through the ice ages, all of our ancestors going back 2 million years, and they weren't having any of these problems. We're not seeing them have the problems that Paul had and others had. They, it's hard to say exactly what what the problem was with them. You do see some of the people like Carnivore Aurelius and Paul Saladino and a few other people that were outspoken about how that they had some problems and things like that, and they blamed it on being in ketosis, because there's a pervasive argument that from Ray Peat that long-term ketosis is harmful, except that the long-term studies on ketogenic diets and ketosis actually show that no, it's not. It does not raise your cortisol. It does not slam your thyroid. It does not drop your testosterone. There's studies looking at people after 24 months, and none of these were a problem. Actually, things improved. And the studies that they were showing were like an 8-week study, a 4-week study, or something like that. And it's just like, well, that's not the same. A 2-year study is obviously going to supersede a 4-week study or 8-week study. So, I wasn't convinced by the evidence. I saw a lot of contrary evidence, better evidence that showed the contrary. And then just living this way, I didn't really buy that, because and practicing this way, I have patients for the last 6 years that I've been treating with a ketogenic carnivore diet. And the first thing we do is ketogenic, because a lot of these people have, metabolic issues, cardiometabolic issues, and ketogenic diets have been proven to work in large scale controlled trials in humans to reverse diabetes, to lower blood pressure, to do all these other sorts of beneficial things. And I see this in practice every single day. And so I've been using this in my practice for, over 6 years now. And I don't see those problems. I see people's testosterone levels go up, not down. I see their thyroid hormones improve, their thyroid function improve. not go away. In fact, it reverses Hashimoto's and many other types of thyroid dysfunction. There's an entire category of plant toxins called goitrogens that cause goiters, which is a large dysfunctional thyroid. And you take those away, it goes away. Right.
Mhm.
So I see people's thyroids improve. I see their cortisol levels improve. Um, definitely see their testosterone levels improve. I have women that are coming out of early menopause or late menopause. I have women in their 50s who have come out of menopause. I have women reversing PCOS and getting their fertility back and all these other sorts of things. So I just see improvement. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of very clear physiological reasons for that. I mean, insulin is a very important hormone. It's involved in hundreds of different processes in your body and your brain, as well as your hormonal regulation. And very simply, for women at menopause and PCOS, insulin blocks the conversion of testosterone into estrogen. Women make testosterone first, and that converts into estrogen in the ovaries. But insulin blocks that conversion, so they get too much testosterone, not enough estrogen, and it's a leading cause of PCOS. And I would bet early menopause. I have women in their late 30s who are going through early menopause. They get their period at once every 4 months or so. They're getting hot flashes, all these other sorts of things. And all of a sudden, you put them on a ketogenic carnivore diet. 4 months later, they have and their insulin at the time was barely registered, and then put them on a ketogenic carnivore diet, and all of a sudden it's perfect for a 25-year-old woman. Their periods are regular, and all their other hormones have improved as well. So I see the opposite. I always
Mhm.
see the opposite. Um, so I just see the opposite in the practice. I see the opposite in the literature, and then just people's lived experience. I mean, there are people who exist on this planet right now who have lived a ketogenic carnivore diet, and the argument is that, well, like the Inuit, there may not even be in ketosis. Well, that's just because their ketone levels are very low. My ketone levels are very low. Why is that? Because I've been keto adapted for nearly a decade now. And so the longer you're in a state of ketosis, the more keto adapted you are, the more efficiently you use those ketones. So you're just making the amount of ketones you need, and then you use them. And so we're comparing apples to oranges because we're comparing people that just start a ketogenic diet and their ketones are 5 or 7 or something like that. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm having so much ketones and I'm peeing it out. Well, that's because you're not using it. Whereas as the months go on, those levels get lower and lower. After about 6 months, usually people's urinary ketones go away and they think, oh, I'm not in ketosis anymore because I'm not pissing out ketones. No, it means you're using those ketones. You're still making the same amount. It's just you're using them now and using
Mhm.
them more efficiently. And you're always using them, but using them more efficiently. And so after years and years and years, those ketone levels go down, 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 not because you're not making as much, but because you're using them better. And so it's the same with the Inuit. They have, you know, zero point 0.3, zero point 0.4 on their ketones, just like me, just like other people who are in a ketogenic state for a long period of time. And, one of the things that Paul says, like, well, I mean, there's a lot of glycogen in muscle meat. There's actually quite a lot of glycogen. And, but the argument is like, well, they're getting carbs from that. Like, okay, and we're getting carbs from that. But the point is, you can get everything you need from meat. And if you do need a bit of glycogen, if you do need a bit of carbs, the amount that you need is fully covered by the meat that you eat. That's the point. So it's
Mhm.
not that, and you will be in a ketogenic state. You won't spike your insulin with that glycogen. You will still be. And what is a ketogenic state? It doesn't mean that your ketones are above X level. That's how people define it. I think that's a dumb definition. Ketogenic diet is probably misnamed as a ketogenic diet. We're just saying there's ketones there. Okay. But what is it? It is a fat burning metabolism. You're in a metabolism where you're burning fat. And in fact, in biochemistry now, they don't even call it a fasting state and a fed state. They call it a carbohydrate state and a non carbohydrate state. Right. And so it's just a non carbohydrate state. We're running on fat instead of carbs. We're running on a bit of carbs. But yeah, so, I understand where they're coming from on that. But
Mhm.
I think that the evidence is pretty strongly against them.
Mhm.
And,
For all
I was just going to
sorry,
say
you
just
go.
one last thing. The problems that these guys had, I don't know exactly what it is. They seem to be ones that were really pushing organs, just eat tons and tons of organs.
Mm.
You can get hypervitaminosis. You can get hypervitaminosis A. We know that suppresses TSH and that can cause thyroid dysfunction. It can cause other hormonal disruption as well. Could that be part of it? I don't know. I know that Frank Tufano was eating a lot, was, promoting liver and liver supplements and liver snacks and things like that. And then he took Accutane, which is a vitamin A analog. And so if you're slightly hypervitaminosis A and you add on retinol, and then all of a sudden you had all these problems, and then he blamed it on ketosis, and it's just like, well, just the
Mhm.
Accutane itself is a horrible drug. I mean, I cannot believe this stuff is still legal to give people. It causes so many problems with people, and it can exacerbate an already high level of vitamin A. Now, I don't know for sure that that's what it is. I'm not their doctor or anything like that, but I'm just saying there are plausible reasons that could be explained from other explanations. And one thing is that, well, I'm eating the same amount, and that's one thing that Paul has said, is that he's eating the same amount of organs now as he was previously. But when you add in carbohydrates, it actually raises your body's um, demand for different vitamins and minerals. So just the act of eating carbohydrates will actually, A, it will reduce the absorption of a lot of these things, and B, it will raise the threshold of what you need. The amount of vitamin C we need is very different if we're not eating enough meat or we're eating carbohydrates. It changes dramatically. And the same is true for other vitamins as well. And the one thing I do know, that whatever caused their problems, I know it wasn't being in ketosis, because there are
Mhm.
millions and millions and millions of other people the entirety of humanity, going back, to the beginning of humankind, have been in long-term ketogenic states. I mean, this is actually recognized, funny enough, by the institutes of science and things like that. They said there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. The amount of carbohydrates you need throughout your life, to maintain life and health, is apparently zero. There are entire civilizations that don't eat any carbohydrates outside of what they get from meat, throughout their entire life, and as long as they're getting enough proteins and fats, they're fine.
Mhm.
And so whatever caused their problems, it wasn't ketosis.
Mhm. The other type of person that I see, sometimes run into issues on carnivore are people who are very active and very lean and, eating
Mhm,
lots of lean meat. But, when these people up their fat intake, I've seen it time and time again, all their
mhm.
problems go away. A lot of
Yeah, you
people,
need
instead of
yeah.
exactly, a lot of people, instead of adding fat, they'll add fruit. And all of a sudden, they've got a lot more energy coming in. They gain some weight. Like, oh, well, it was the long term ketogenic state. When in reality, just probably weren't eating enough.
No, I mean, fat's an essential nutrient. There's essential fatty acids you have to have or you get sick and die. There's essential fat soluble nutrients you have to have or you get sick and die. And it's also an essential energy source as well. We're not supposed to be running on proteins. We're just not. And again, if gluconeogenesis doesn't change with what you're eating, and so you can't rely on protein being used for gluconeogenesis to drive, because it doesn't change. It doesn't really
Mm,
change based on what you're eating, right? So it's not necessarily going to cover that gap. And there is something called protein poisoning or rabbit starvation, where if you are getting the majority of your calories from protein, it doesn't work, and your body starts shutting down, and you can get very sick, and definitely get very low energy and diarrhea and all these other sorts of problems. And rapid weight loss, all these other sorts of things, because you just don't have energy available. What proteins are for, these amino acids are for the building blocks and the structural material of your body. Every single molecule that your DNA um, codes for strings of amino acids. So all those, three base pairs, that's an amino acid, amino acid, amino acid. So that codes for that, and you're just stacking up these links of amino acids in this big long chain, and then they're folded into a certain way, and they have this big sort of protein structure that has a job. Those are all made out of amino acids. They may add some different groups to that, but the base chain is amino acids. So that's what protein is for. Proteins are to make the building blocks of our life, every single molecule that our DNA makes. That's what protein is for. And it's not for energy. And so that's another thing about this whole calories in, calories out nonsense. You don't use the majority of the protein that you eat as calories, so you can't really use that in the equation for calories in, calories out anyway. And so it's a bit more complicated than that. But um, no, you have to have an alternate energy source as well. And so carbohydrates can be an alternate to fat. And it's better than just doing protein, because you get very sick just doing the lean protein. But it's not nearly as good as the fat. The fat is what we're made for, what we're designed for. So yeah, I see a lot of people have problems if they're under eating fat.